Okay, everyone, let's continue on our analysis of public health and how it plays out in relation to socioeconomic class. So the last lecture, we ended by saying your zip code is the most predictive thing about your life expectancy and what the future looks like in terms of your health. Now we want to focus on class, that are you wealthy, are you middle class, are you working class, are you poor? And I want to start off with the question of when are you most likely to get sick during the semester? And turns out that statistically there's a definitive answer to this. And in every semester they tend to cluster at two times, midterms and finals. So middle of the semester, end of the semester. And why is that? I'll let you wonder for a moment. Maybe no surprise, it has to do with high levels of stress over midterms and finals. That stress compromises your immune system. And whenever you have a compromised immune system, pathogens, other things that would bounce off of you, colds, bronchitis, flu, don't bounce off of you. And so, as you all read for class today, places with really high levels of stress in our country also have lower life expectancy, higher rates of chronic disease because they live under constant, unrelenting stress. As students, you can, at a minimum, feel two spikes of stress during the semester, and that's not the only time. Students can feel stress other times as well, and many do. But you can predictably see two spikes of stress for most students, and that's when people get sick. And stress raises cholesterol. It releases high levels of cortisol and adrenaline, which is your fight or flight response. But if you're releasing cortisol and adrenaline all the time, if you're always having a fight or flight response, well, your body's not designed for that all the time. And it wears down your organs, it wears down your immune system, it leads to weight gain, rapid aging, and much higher rates of chronic disease and disability. These are all just some examples, and you can look at the PowerPoint in Blackboard, but assume and trust me that high levels of stress are negative on your body, on the organs, on your brain, on your mental health. And so poverty and unsafe environments take a toll on individuals in two main ways. They're not mutually exclusive. They sort of reinforce one another. One is just living in places that aren't safe, that have high levels of garbage and trash and violence and lack of cleanliness, and apartments that don't have good ventilation. All of that leads to higher levels of asthma, higher rates of coping mechanisms to deal with areas that aren't safe and don't have access to healthy food, and don't have parks and playgrounds to play in and be physically fit. If it's not safe to go out, you stay inside a lot more. And if you stay inside a lot more, then you don't get physically fit, and you're breathing the same unclean air. These are just fascinating maps of New York City. The dots and the red areas are the places that have traditionally been high areas of poverty, entrenched poverty. So just kind of mentally fixate on where poverty is in New York. And then you start seeing where are those who have poor health? Where are children who have higher rates of asthma? And it's the same places. It's the low income, high stress areas, high rates of diabetes and obesity. And most recently, where do you see the biggest cases of COVID? Well, it's not Manhattan. They all fled or could stay safer. It's the places that are poor and less healthy, and where people have to go outside and work. They can't stay home and earn a living inside their apartments. And this is just more data showing this is where the people fled. So the wealthy part of Manhattan, if you had a second home or you could get on a plane or drive somewhere safe, you got out. And so the epicenter of the COVID outbreak, you just weren't there to be vulnerable to it. And look, it's who took off. It's the people who had high income. They're the top 1%, 5%. They're the ones who took off. And they tend to live in Manhattan, partly also in Brooklyn. But the lower income areas, Bronx, Queens, and Staten Island, don't have the second homes and the means to leave, and they have to have a job. These are the places that had the forwarding address rates that were the highest. It's the places that had the means to get out. Where'd they go? Everywhere, anywhere to get out of the worst COVID outbreak in the United States. They took off. And this is before COVID. This effect will be even bigger. The places that are the poorest have an average loss of life expectancy of 10 years. The wealthier places, mid-80s, the poorer places, mid-70s. Interestingly, when they do heat maps of cities, the wealthy areas, even in the hot days of summer, have more trees, more spaced out estates. So the heat isn't as hot there. In the downtown areas where there's lower income neighborhoods, the heat is higher. Same in Baltimore, same in Washington, D.C. These are the affluent suburbs. These are the poorer areas that's all concrete and cement, which, now that sounds discouraging, and it is. There are some really cool experiments, and they've done them in Philadelphia. They've taken these vacant lots, vacant buildings, and they've got a control group that they just leave as they are. They have ones that just clean up the trash, and then they have ones that they green. They put plants in, and they make them really nice. They randomly select them, and these are the places that didn't just get cleaned up. They had gardens grown, trees planted, people could get out and work in these areas. And spoiler alert, if you clean places up and put gardens in them, people's mental health in those areas improves from before to after. So it's just encouraging. And you guys, please click on this. This is a great segment by the PBS NewsHour where doctors are increasingly prescribing time in nature. And they'll get on buses, take people who are in inner cities, people who are sort of trapped in unhealthy areas, and just take them out for an afternoon. And their heart rates go down, their mood elevates. Nature is therapeutic. And we know that because people who have means live near them. Universities like ours have them because they're healthy. Which brings me to something that now doesn't shock people, but I remember the first time I saw this map, I want to say maybe 15 years ago. I remember seeing this map for the first time and thinking, nope, there has to be a mistake. There's just no way that your zip code or where you live could actually consign you to living less long than your parents and grandparents. I didn't know. I just assumed, like most people, that all generations live a little bit longer than the generations before them. Well, guess what? That has all changed in the last 2 generations, last 1 to 2 generations. We have this phenomenon that you all read about and watched, which is we have growing areas of the country where people are dying younger than their parents. The life expectancy curve has actually curved down. It isn't inexorably going up all the time. And these are the areas, the red areas, where you're seeing people die younger than their parents. And these places die 15 to 20 years earlier than the wealthy parts of the United States. And this is all the data that shows that being wealthier in the higher income percentiles, you live longer for both women and men. Interestingly, men never close the gap with women. Women just live longer. We'll explore that later on in this class. It might be just sort of payback for more of the stuff women have to put up with over the course of their lifetime. But being wealthier is better. You live longer. And you read the article about the sickest town in the United States. Grundy is about 6 hours southwest, mostly west, a little bit south of Richmond and Charlottesville. And this is some of the lowest life expectancy there is. And it's a rural area, Appalachia. Coal mining is not the job creator it used to be. And it's typical of a lot of places that have been left behind. They tend to be more rural. And these poverty places are where life expectancy is going down and down and down. And opioid problems are going up and meth problems are going up. And they're low income. And you can see, incomes for the top 1% have exploded in the last 2 decades. And, this has sort of left more and more of Americans behind. And if you get left behind, your life expectancy goes down. And the richer, these are all the data points that you've seen, and I can just show over and over again. And I almost feel uncomfortable saying it, but if you want to live longer, wealth really helps, right? And the wealth disparities have grown in each area of the country from back in the 1980s to today. The disparities between the rich and poor have expanded significantly. Back then in 1969, there was, of course, variation, but it wasn't dramatic. But now by 2018, New York's, the income per capita, the variation from the rich and the poor has gone up significantly. And you can see graph after graph that just shows, the difference between the rich and the poor have increased. And it's true everywhere. And there are health consequences for that. For those who are left behind, they don't just keep climbing at a slower rate. They actually, in many areas of the country, they fall behind and they start dying earlier. And that messes up our politics, and it messes up our sense of fairness about the American dream. You guys all wrote in your papers like, wow, this is offensive. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are rights. And not that we're all going to have exactly the same life expectancy and the same outcomes. But the fact that you're poor means you're going to start dying earlier. This leveling off of life expectancy. Like, other countries keep growing. China's catching up with us. The United Kingdom is struggling a little bit, but most places continue to advance. And we're the ones, and now we have the coronavirus epidemic that has really highlighted disparities between those who can hunker down in their second and third homes and never be exposed to this and work from home and have things delivered, and those who can't, and those who have to work, and those who have to put themselves at greater risk. As some of you mentioned that you were surprised by how important a job is for your health. Yes, it is really important. And this is some of the data I think I've written back to you about. Wow, they do these studies at places where plants have closed, and they looked at other communities that are very similar, but the plant hasn't closed. Man, a loss of a plant, loss of jobs has a really big impact on health. And then, opioid overdoses spike up in places where there's more plant closures, more job losses. It makes sense, but it's really powerful to see it in the data. And you have probably heard this term now. This is now a term that we understand when we hear it, deaths of despair. And although this graph, even this graph is now a little bit out of date, because at the time this graph came out, it was middle-aged white people, predominantly men, but also women, were driving these deaths of despair, like the leveling off of white life expectancy and even curbing down. But in the most recent cut of data, it's pretty much everybody in the United States is having a leveling off, except for the very top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5%. If you want to read more about this, this is a great book about the Appalachia region. And if you watched, or if you heard about, I'll show you a clip, places like Huntington, West Virginia, just right in this sort of the Rust Belt, the old places where in the 1950s and 60s, there were a lot of jobs. Well, those places have fallen on hard times. And these are the places where you're seeing really big opioid problems. Let me just show you real quick, if you have a chance on Netflix, although how you have any time, after all the work I'm assigning for you guys to watch anything else, but you could watch this later on in the summer. It's a great documentary on what happens to these places where hope is dying off.
Females been locked in the bathroom for over an hour. They can't get to her. She's overdosed on something. Patient is unconscious.
I see this as a problem that has the potential to bankrupt the country. It's sad when you can drive around the city and say, oh, somebody died there, somebody died there.
Right.
You're doing so good.
I lost my job and shit. I couldn't help it. It's the one place I can turn to.
I can't tolerate you lying to your probation officer.
This is our community. We will not be defined by this problem.
Shy away from.
I want to give you some direction and some structure. Usually come out one night a week, then we just give you some food.
Next to one. Upper officer didn't expect nothing from me.
We don't roll that way, do we?
Right, no, man.
Today's special day?
5 months clean.
5 months clean? I don't care if I save somebody 50 times. That's 50 chances to get into long-term recovery.
Again, I really want to recommend this documentary. It's just so educational. It brings up the issue of naloxone and Narcan, which brings people back literally from the dead, on the verge of overdose death, and it's a godsend. It does raise some bioethical issues. It's not free. There's not an unlimited amount of supply of this, and some studies have found that maybe the more it's used, the more in some subconscious way people take slightly more risk because they know there's more people to save them. It's impossible to really tease that out, but here's some creativity and innovation that addresses the problem, but it's way downstream. Like I can't think of a more intense downstream example than Narcan to bring people out. What we need is to go upstream to the things that are causing the overdoses and the despair in the first place. Now, I've taken students to work down in Grundy, and I've worked in places like this with remote area medical. And one of the things in healthcare you will often wrestle with is that you want to help everybody, right? But we live in a world of scarce resources and limited empathy. And you guys can read this slide. Sometimes there's this thinking, and I even posted it on the discussion prompt today on Blackboard. There are places, maybe Grundy doesn't need to be saved because it can't be saved. Maybe these towns are not savable because the economy can't really be resurrected there. And maybe the most humane thing is to almost evacuate people to near closer towns where there are jobs and where there are opportunities. And then you can read this. There's people who are even less sympathetic who are just like, these places are dying in part because they're almost doomed. And if they're doomed, then sending in more Narcan and more free clinics is, in their estimation, a waste of time. I think it's something you have to wrestle with. All of this speaks to the social determinants of health, the things in our lives around us, the things we don't even notice, the people we hang out with, the quality of our housing, the food, the water, the shelter, access to parks, savings, transportation. We tend to think, well, our health is our access to healthcare and just, maybe if we eat pretty well. And well, it's that, but it's all the stuff around us. It's everything near us. And if you don't have all those things going for you, if you live in a place where you have none of those things going for you, then your individual health is going to be profoundly impacted. And there's just interesting data to show that places that have more overall equality, a big middle class and very little poverty and very sort of not massive amounts of wealth, tend to have better health outcomes. And the places that are less equal and there's more disparities, you have more places like I showed you in the map, life expectancy is bad. And even here in the United States, an interesting thing to find is that we have 50 states, and some of those states, relatively speaking, have more equality of resources and wealth, and other places like the South, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, have extraordinary polarization and disparity of wealth. And these places have worse health outcomes. And love our Mormons in Utah and Wisconsin, New Hampshire, Iowa, places that generally speaking, compared to the Deep South that just have more overall equity, have better health outcomes. And so this is the most recent data that's showing that it was just sort of middle-aged whites at one point that had lower life expectancy, but now this phenomenon that is stemming from inequality and growing inequality is now starting to cut across other racial boundaries. And this is one of the challenges of public health, is that you always ask individuals, always be rational, always do what's in your own interest. Well, that's tough to put all the onus on individuals. And are we rational all the time? No. Sometimes we're tired. Sometimes we don't have enough resources to always do what's in our best interest all the time. And these are great books that actually show how as human beings, we're kind of predictably irrational. And there's ways that, and I always tell the example, I walk past Salad Works every day to go to Chipotle. Now I teach public health. I would be healthier going to Salad Works. I've never once in my life, never once gone to Salad Works, been to Chipotle way too many times. Why? Because I want what I want. And so I rationalize it too. I get the salad at Chipotle. So you guys watch this. People do stupid things, but for rational reasons. And public health has to come to grips with that. When you work in public health, you realize that's the reality. And so you have to find ways to impact that and address that. Yes, people do stupid things, but for rational reasons. I want to close this by saying, for those who've been to college or in college, you've seen it on weekends. You've seen people behave not in their self-interest. It often involves alcohol. And many years ago, the 1980s, we said, hey, we got a problem of drunk driving, so we need to raise the drinking age. So we'd raise the drinking age to 21, and that helped lower drunk driving deaths on the highway plus. But it's unexpectedly and accidentally given a rise to binge drinking, because now that it's against the law, people still drink, but they don't want to get in trouble. This is exactly like Elizabeth Pisani saying. They do stupid things, but for rational reasons. And young people will want to drink alcohol, not everybody, but a lot of them will. And since it's against the law, they'll do it in ways that they can't be monitored so they don't get caught. And that leads to more binge drinking. So in public health, and I'll close out on this, there's a concept called harm reduction, which means in a perfect world, we'd have no alcohol problems. We'd have no HIV problems. We'd have no unplanned pregnancies, but we don't live in a perfect world. What we can, though, do is reduce harm reduction, by changing policies and changing programs. And that's the goal in public health, is harm reduction. So I'll end by saying there's a growing movement to lower the drinking age back to 18 or 19, but then add all these extra regulations like a drinking license. And that way, by having it be legal, you can regulate it, monitor it more, as opposed to pretending it doesn't exist right now and then it goes underground. But, well, acknowledge that it's there like it used to be before 1984 and then just regulate it more. I'd love to see what you all think about that. Take care, and I'll see you all tomorrow.
You have stopped screen share.